So what you checked was not starting with one.
I'm asking.
No, we are starting with one, yeah. It's okay. 3 years of law school, I can figure this out. Lord only hope, just follow along. Yeah. Like, numbers.
It could be worse. You could be taking my Con Law 2 exam right now.
Been there, done that.
Some people in here have taken my Con Law 2 exam. It's fun.
We'll take that.
So it starts today. I guess Bar Foundations does count, but as of today, this is your full-time job. And it has to be your full-time job. The way to pass the bar is to keep your tail in the chair all summer and memorize as much law as you can. That's the secret. You got to get off the Facebook. You got to tell your friends, I'll see you in August, and you just have to sit down and do it. You don't have to be learned hand to pass the North Carolina bar. But what you need to do is keep your tail in the chair and memorize as much law as you can. As you'll see today, there's a lot of law here that you all haven't seen before. So just pick any random Tuesday night at 10 o'clock p.m. Look around the library, and all of those people that you see will pass. And because you're there, you will pass too. It's just about learning as much law as you can, figuring out how to apply it, and figuring out what to do when you see a question that you don't understand or you don't know what you're being asked. So as to MBEs, the way to study for the MBE is to take as many MBEs as you can and to understand why you got the wrong answer. It's efficient too, because that's what tells you what's on the MBE part of the exam. So because that's the best way to study for the MBE, we're going to go through the right answers for these, but we're also going to go through the wrong answers and talk about why they're wrong. So we'll do about half of these and we'll take a 10-minute break, then we'll come back. But don't freak out yet. If you got about half of these right, and some of these were not easy. Like I said, some of these were in areas of law that I guarantee you didn't do in torts. But if you got about half of these right, the third week of May, then torts is a strong subject for you for purposes of the MBE. If you take an entire MBE, which I think you guys are going to do at the end of this week, get about 50% on that, you're right where you need to be. Even if you're not where you need to be, you know how to get to where you need to be. Any questions about any of that? Let's go. So, I numbered these like I think how you did it. What you have in front of you is the answers, but they're numbered differently, but they're in the same order. But don't look at those yet. No spoilers. Hashtag no spoilers. So, assistant goes into computer, get stuff off computer. Stuff is concerning matters of public interest. Distributes stuff. Now, owner of stuff is mad and wants to know what they can do. I'm going to try not to say this too many times today, but if you had me for torts, you're familiar with the tort of intrusion upon seclusion. One of the two main privacy torts that are tested on the MBE. The elements, intrusion upon a private area that would be highly offensive to the reasonable person. So you know that. You've identified that from these facts. So let's take a look at the answers. A, because the assistant was invitee on the premises, fine. You know that's wrong. Because it's not relevant whether or not the assistant was an invitee on the premises. Because assistant has gone beyond the scope of consent, because assistant was not an invitee to the information on the password locked computer. So you know that's wrong. Let's go to C. Has the assistant invaded the writer's privacy? Correct. You'll see why B and D are wrong in a minute. And C is right because B and D are more wrong. And it is sentences like that are the reason why I never ask multiple choice questions on my exams, which has put you at a disadvantage for the MBE, but I'm not complicit in that. So this is an intrusion upon seclusion. As you'll see, B and D are not relevant to the tort of intrusion upon seclusion. So the answer is going to be C. B, the fact that this is a matter of public concern, again, is not relevant to the claim of intrusion upon seclusion. It is relevant to the claim of public disclosure of private facts. It's a defense. You can disclose private facts about somebody, but might not be liable if that information is of public concern, but not relevant here. All that matters is that invasion of privacy. And then D, not relevant either, because you don't have to actually publish anything to be liable for the tort of intrusion upon seclusion. The harm, the legal interest that the tort protects is the right to be free in a private place. Some of these are easy, some of these are hard. I would definitely put that one on the harder end of the scale. Number 2, another tort that you did not see in torts, not even if you were in my class, but is tested heavily. Not just on the MBE, but also on the essay portion of the bar. Defamation. You have to memorize the elements of defamation. What are the elements of defamation? Language that defames, using a word to define a word there. But all that means is that it has to be language that harms the person's reputation. Of and concerning has to be about that person. Publication just means that the defamatory statement has to be said to someone else. And then actual harm to the reputation. So that's the basics. Once you understand the basics, you also have to remember there's 2 kinds of defamation. Written libel, and spoken slander. Usually, you need damages to recover if the defamation is spoken, if the defamation is slander. Why? Because the law believed and still believes that saying something about somebody hurts their reputation less, I should say, than writing something about somebody. Why? Because writing lasts longer than speaking. So the general rule, you needed to show damages in order to recover if the defamatory statement was spoken. But there's such thing as slander per se. What's slander per se? Where a statement about someone is so harmful that they don't have to show damages. Put aside loathsome disease. Put aside business reputational harm and focus on that one. If you accuse someone of a crime that involves moral turpitude, bad faith, then the person who sues you for defamation does not have to show actual damages. Once you know that, this is easy. A, does the friend have to believe the defamatory statement? No. Not relevant to a defamation claim. So you resolve that without having to resort to the difference between libel and slander. No, because the man can't show any monetary damages. Wrong too. Why? Because of the nature of the defamatory statement. It's bad enough that we're not going to force him to have to show damages. We're going to presume that there were damages, because the sentence was slander per se. The man was upset. That's not relevant. So then you know D is the right answer. The sentence was false, the statement was false, which is what it has to be. Truth is a defense to libel and slander. Remember that. And it was a crime in moral turpitude. Here, arson. So the slander claim can go forward. Any questions about questions 1 or 2? All right. Let's get on the easy side of the scale. Manufacturing plant emits a noise. Owner installs dampers. You might remember the sriracha hypo if you had someone for torts. So he lives near the plant. He couldn't sleep because of the sound. But very importantly here, this is the tell in this question. The other residents did not notice the noise. So the first thing you notice, this is a claim of private nuisance, right? You're using your land in a way that affects my enjoyment of mine. But what's the thing that you have to remember? If you remember this one thing, you will get this question right. The use of the word unreasonably means this is an objective standard. So if this prospective plaintiff has some unusual sensitivity with respect to this use of the land, he is going to lose. Because whenever you see unreasonably, you know that the standard is objective and not subjective. And once you understand all that, you know that A is right. Why is A right? Again, because the noise did not bother the neighbors. This guy is complaining of a particular subjective sensitivity. But for a claim of private nuisance to lie, the interference with the use of land has to be substantial and unreasonable. Objectively unreasonable. Real.
I think we had a case that was similar where there was like a noise and a little kid had bad eardrums or something like that. If you were gonna apply like the eggshell skull rule to this, would other people, so it would have to be like objectively unreasonable to everyone else first, and then the extent of the damages would be different based on that?
Exactly. So the hypo is from a note case in the first year. There's a kid who's in a neighborhood with a church. There's something wrong with his ears. The church bells are going off. It bothers him, but not everybody else. His family sues on his behalf. He loses. Same reason. He has a particular sensitivity. But if the interference had been with everybody's use of the land and it hurts him more than it hurts everybody else, then the person using the land that's causing the substantial unreasonable interference is liable for all of the damages because of the eggshell skull rule. I can't do it. Chapman. Anything else? So all these are wrong. The plant operates only during the day. That doesn't matter. There's such a thing as an unreasonable interference during the day. That doesn't make any sense. Yes, the noise is heard beyond the boundaries of the plant, but that's true in almost every case, right? So that alone doesn't show an unreasonable interference. And then again, D is based on the subjective interference. The fact that it's an unreasonable interference means that the P has to show that the use is unreasonable, that would offend the reasonable person's use of the land. Number 4. So you got this truck in the back, as my son would say, some yucky stuff. It spills. Somebody slips on that yucky stuff and crashes. There you see strict liability. So we said there are easy questions and hard questions, and then there are some that look easy but are actually hard. So when you saw toxic materials, when you saw strict liability, you thought that, right? Strict liability for abnormally dangerous activities. Boiled down, that's when you have strict liability for abnormally dangerous activities. But something that we don't talk about, or at least we didn't talk about it enough when we talked about strict liability, you still need causation. In order for strict liability to apply, the conduct that was abnormally dangerous has to be the cause of the harm. If you knew that, or if you thought that through as a matter of logic, when you read the fact pattern and said to yourself, this harm didn't come to the plaintiff because this material was toxic, so this is a red herring. In other words, the fact that it's toxic is intended to trick you. You knew that B was right. In other words, the reason this car crashes in this fact pattern is not because the material is toxic. The fact that material is toxic is what's going to make strict liability applicable. The abnormally dangerous conduct was not a cause of fact of the harm, so this is a negligence case. B is the right answer. C, wrong. That's what the bar examiner wants you to say, right? Wants you to see toxicity, wants you to think abnormally dangerous activity, wants you to go to liability under strict liability. And no, that's the trick. The dangerousness of this material had nothing to do with the harm that the defendant caused. D, not sure what that means. I guess it's trying to get you to think about the fact that some activities can be abnormally dangerous depending on where they are. Where is the fireworks show? Is it in an open field? Is it in a crowded area? Where is the blasting taking place? And then A, I'm not sure what that means. An intervening cause is something that a third party does, not what the plaintiff does. Any questions about that one? Good. All right. Sometimes MBEs are easy. They look easy, and they are easy. Russian roulette, the classic contributory negligence hypo, right? These two guys go to a had drinks, Russian roulette, load it up, spin, and then they don't want to completely gross you out during the bar exam, so they say the man shot the friend in the shoulder. So what's the issue? Whether the game constituted a joint venture. I don't even know what that means. That's BA. We're doing torts. I guess maybe they're trying to get you to think of concerted action, but that's not relevant here either. This one's tricky. Whether the friend could validly consent to the game. That is wrong for a nitpicky reason, right? Consent is a defense to intentional torts, and we know that this is a negligence claim. What is consent in the context of a negligence claim? Assumption of risk. If you consent to a battery, to assault, to false imprisonment, if you're talking about a negligence claim, you're talking about assumption of risk. So you know the answer is C. Is someone who is harmed while playing Russian roulette, did they breach duty to prevent harm from coming to themselves? I mean, to ask that question is to answer it. Of course. Of course that's contributory negligence. And then D is a little trickier than it looks, I think. What it's trying to get you there, to do there, is to deviate down because of intoxication with respect to the standard of care that he owed to himself, but you know you don't deviate down. So that's wrong too. Any questions about that one? Let's talk about assumption of risk. Let's go bowling. Take the skinheads bowling. So this woman signs up for a class. They have her sign a waiver for a bowling class. Okay. The instructor drops a bowling ball on her foot. She sues for negligence. Instructor says, you signed a waiver. She's got a problem because she signed a waiver. Let's start with the general principle of assumption of risk. Like we just said, right? Assumption of risk is consent in the context of negligence. If the P subjectively knew, understood, and undertook the harm, then you have an assumption of risk. Contrast that with contributory negligence. That's if you were objectively unreasonable, if you acted unreasonably to prevent harms from coming to yourself. Assumption of risk is subjective. Then you remember there's implied assumption of risk, there's express assumption of risk. And then your torts teacher said, oh, they're all implied assumption of risk cases. There aren't very many waiver cases. Well, I guess I was wrong. An express assumption of risk, you've expressly assumed the risk. You have signed something that says, I assume the risk. So the plaintiff, to overcome that, has to argue that the risks that I assumed are those that are inherent to the activity for which I signed the waiver. And if something happens to me that's outside of anything I could have contemplated when I signed the waiver, I might be able to overcome the fact that I signed the waiver. So let's start with C. It's unreasonable to require the woman to sign a waiver before she was allowed to bowl. Of course not, right? We sign waivers all the time. It's not unreasonable to ask somebody to sign a waiver before they partake in an activity. What about D? I'm not sure why D is wrong. This happens sometimes. Welcome to bar study. B is probably more right. But according to the MBE, D is wrong. Don't get frustrated. You're going to do 200 of these, okay? Go ahead, Moy.
When they're talking about public policy consequences of her own negligence, it was not her own negligence that caused it. It was
When they're talking about insulating, you're talking about insulating
that's what you're talking about.
yourself from liability to the person you harmed. But this, to me, where she signed the form, she could not foresee that the instructor would drop a bowling ball on her foot. That looks to me like an analysis of whether or not the harm was inherent to the activity in question. You win some, you lose some. According to the MBE, B is right. But as I said, I teach this stuff, and I'm not totally sure of the difference between B and D. But that's life. I passed the bar. You can too. And then A is stupid. Sorry if you put it down. Doesn't mean you're stupid. But I don't understand what they were getting at with A. Bowling is an inherently dangerous activity. I mean, it's true when I was on the bowling team. The maximum handicap, add to your score, was a 75. Mine was a 75. So I was literally the worst possible bowler. All right, this one, I would put this one in the category of looks easy, harder than it looks. Fact pattern, pretty common. doctrine that might apply bystander recovery, right? So, you can recover based on someone else's harm if all three of these are met. Blood or familial relation, viewing the accident, death or serious injury. So, what about A? Let's get interactive. Is A right? Why not? Why not? No relationship. There was no blood or familial relationship between the pedestrian and the person that was harmed. And for the bystander recovery rule to apply, you need all three. So any of these answers, as we'll see, that attempt to rely on a theory of recovery that is the bystander recovery rule are not going to be the right answer. B, not sure what that means. C, again, wrong. Emotional distress is not enough. You need all three of those elements. So you need a different theory of liability. What is it? Zone of danger. Good job by you guys. No familial relation. So he needs something else. What does he need? He needs his own proximity to the accident. He was close enough to the accident to where a court will presume that any harms that he suffered as a result of viewing that accident are legitimate. Remember, the zone of danger comes from the impact rule, where you had to have something hit you in order to recover for emotional distress. And then court said, well, that's silly. You know, this doctrine has deteriorated to the point where people are winning cases or not based on whether or not they're hit from some particles that came off of an accident. No. These cases are really about whether or not someone is within the zone of danger. If you're within the zone of danger, you could have been hurt by that accident yourself. And if you could have been hurt by that accident yourself, you can recover. Questions about that one? All right, let's do one more and then take a break. Products liability. There's nothing I love more. Let's focus on this. The booklet that accompanied the vaporizer read, "This vaporizer will not spill." Then what happens? The vaporizer spills. Spill. Spill. That's the tell. So, 3 ways to recover when someone is harmed by a product. Negligence, that's just negligence. Manufacturer, you did not act reasonably in your manufacture of this product and it caused me a harm. When you start studying essays, negligence, the only way to recover, well, I shouldn't say that. One of the only 2 ways to recover in North Carolina, because North Carolina has no strict products liability. Strict liability, you can recover. Manufacturer or someone else in marketing chain can be strictly liable if they're harmed by a product. And then, something that we don't talk about much in torts because it is contracts. Warranties. I was at this alumni thing in DC a couple years ago, and I had some law student, we were just talking, and she said, "Oh, do you remember that time when Gabriel asked that question on the exam, what was the difference between contract and torts?" It's like, you thought your contracts exam was bad. This is contracts. You made a misrepresentation. So if you remembered breach of warranty, and you saw that the vaporizer said it would not spill and then it spilled, you saw that breach of warranty was the best way for this motion by the manufacturer to be denied. And the rest of these are a little tricky, but they're all wrong. B, harm alone is not enough. People are harmed by products all the time. That doesn't mean that someone was negligent. That doesn't mean that strict liability is appropriate. That doesn't mean that someone breached a duty. C, trickier, right? If you did products liability, you talked about the fact that a danger that is open and obvious can be a defense in strict liability or in negligence. You cannot bring a claim if you're cut by a knife and you say this knife is too sharp. Courts can say that's open and obvious danger. You can't collect. But this defect was not open and obvious. Why? In part because of this warranty that said it was spill proof. Safer alternative design, that's a trick. They're just trying to get you to think about strict liability there. As we said, the misrepresentation claim is better. Raise your hand if you got 8 out of 8. 7 out of 8. I'm just kidding. I'm not going to do that. Like I said at the beginning, getting these wrong is the way that you study. Let's take a 10-minute break. Remind yourself during that break that it is May, not July. What? It is May. I didn't give out any handouts. I don't have them. Yeah. Did I say 10 minutes? Yeah. Cool. How many people are over there?
second, we've been ours not over. This is the second question.
I just went over there.
You're so hot. Sophie Murray is. Yeah.
I just went over there, and it's the keeping your tail in the seat pep talk. I think it's fine. I thought it was live, Jeff, but it's not. All right. I just went over there. They just started.
So what you're saying now
It's very confusing.
Sean, did you ever watch anime yet? When you see those pigeons, it's like, why do you use? They're all in Netflix now.
Let's start back up with something again that you probably may not have seen in the first year. Sorry. The first thing to remember, again, something we probably don't talk about enough in torts. Every single element of the prima facie case, duty, breach, cause and fact, proximate cause, damages, all have to be shown by a preponderance of the evidence. Now we're live. Each one. If any one of those prima facie elements cannot be shown, then the claim will fail. What is a preponderance of the evidence? Greater than 50%. There's the tell, right? A reasonable chance. Yes, he may have survived. What they're trying to find out if whether or not you studied the loss of a chance doctrine. And that's just a doctrine applicable usually in medical malpractice cases where sometimes less than 50% is enough. If medical malpractice causes you some heightened risk or death of injury, even if you can't show a preponderance of the evidence, you can still meet that part of your claim. So with a lot of this stuff, MBE as well as essay, you either know it or you don't. If you knew this, you'd get it right. If you didn't know it, you wouldn't. So if you know loss of a chance, you know that A is wrong. Because the traditional common law rule concerning burden of proof with respect to each element of the negligence claim is 50%. Strict liability, I'm not sure what that means. A, we don't talk a whole lot about strict liability in medical malpractice cases. But strict liability, the rule is still preponderance of the elements with respect, preponderance of the evidence, sorry, with respect to each part of the claim. So again, if you knew loss of a chance, you got this right. If you didn't know it, you didn't. But now you know it, so next time you'll know to see it. You know, getting MBEs wrong again and again and again is very bad for your ego, but as I said at the beginning, it's a very efficient way to study. And then loss of consortium, I'm not sure what that means. They're not going to let you recover on a claim with less than a preponderance of the evidence just because the claim is based on a theory of loss of consortium. All right. Here come two good ones. You've got a TV that somebody made. An appliance store buys that TV to sell to the customer. Customer buys the TV blows up. Customer sues appliance store. If you saw that, you're well on your way to getting this right. Again, 50%. What's another exception to the preponderance of the evidence rule? Everybody say it. Res ipsa loquitur. Whether you pass the bar or not, you'll still know how to say res ipsa loquitur. So, when do you flip the burden through the use of res ipsa loquitur, type of accident that happens in the absence of negligence, and exclusive control when that negligence happened? Again, remember here the claim is against the appliance store, happened 2 years after the purchase. A, wrong. Only one of the two elements for res ipsa, right? B, no, because the store sold the television. That's a trick too. Remember, we said that strict liability, you sue anybody in the chain, includes the store as well as the manufacturer, but this is a claim in négligence, which is French for negligence. Privity, also a trick. Privity, not even a requirement for strict liability claims. Certainly not one for negligence claims. And then D is the right answer. Please, MBE, give me more res ipsa. Okay. This is something that the MBE loves to add to the fact patterns. Non-delegible duties. You can't delegate a duty away that you would ordinarily owe. That's all that means. So again, res ipsa loquitur. Is it a type of accident that happens in the absence of negligence? Was the instrument that caused the accident probably in the exclusive control of this D? So let's go to C first. Should the store get out because of the fact of this independent contractor was the one who was probably negligent? No. Because the duty to keep shoppers safe was non-delegable. Delegable. No, because the store is strictly liable for the shopper's injuries? No way. If there was strict liability to an invitee, then we would all be shopping on Amazon because no one would have a store for people to come into. If there was strict liability for any injury that someone suffered when coming into that store. D was right in the last one, wrong in this one. Even if the inference of negligence was with respect to inference of this person who is operating this escalator, because the duty owed to the invitee was non-delegable, that's enough to infer liability by the store. And that's the right answer. We were not finished with res ipsa loquitur, unfortunately. Just ask those two questions. Does this ordinarily happen in the absence of negligence? Is it likely that this happened on the product? The negligence that caused the accident, was it likely that that happened when the instrument that caused the negligence was within the exclusive control of this D? All right. Let's cleanse the palate with an easy one. A lot of deviating up, deviating down. 14-year-old teenager, low intelligence, drives a car, runs somebody over. The RPPUTC. The conduct to which the defendant's conduct will be compared is that of the hypothetical RPPUTC, reasonably prudent person under the circumstances. So you've got a child, deviate down. Child with like skills and experience. So if you've got a 14-year-old of low intelligence, you're going to deviate down in a way that you don't if the defendant is an adult, right? Because you don't deviate down for low intelligence in the case of an adult defendant, you do in the case of a child. But adult-only activity, deviate back up. And this is a little inefficient to go down and back up, but it helps you to think it through. So then the question to ask is this an adult-only activity? The answer to that is, of course, yes. Is the pedestrian likely to prevail? Only the teenager's parents. I'm not sure what that means. Because a 14-year-old can be liable. B is wrong too, because it is offering you the incorrect standard of care. This is an adult activity, so you're not going to compare this 14-year-old to other 14-year-olds of like skills and experience and intelligence, because C is the right answer. And then D, I think that's about negligence per se, right? But not relevant to this case. Any questions about that one? All right. So, tricky, controversial, wrongful birth, wrongful life. Not that tricky. If you remember, this is what you do and you remember. You take your hands, you put them here, and you remember. The claim is not that the child is disabled, suffered a birth defect, because of the medical malpractice. That's just medical malpractice. The claim is that if the doctor had acted reasonably, the child would not have been born. And the parents have incurred costs as a result of that child with the birth defect, with a condition that the parents would not have incurred. Because if the medical advice was correct, the child would not have been born. Either because the pregnancy would have been terminated, in the more controversial version of this, right? Because the child would not have been born if the parents knew about the defect, or in this case, the less controversial version, the child would not have been conceived at all. These parents are saying, if this doctor had told us that our child was going to be born deaf, we would not have had another child. Does that make sense? Do you understand the difference? So, you know A is wrong. The child is not deaf due to medical malpractice. The child was born because of inadequate information provided by the doctor. A reasonable doctor would have identified this genetic condition, which would have caused this deafness, and we would not have conceived the child. If you understand that difference, this is not a hard question. And you know that B is right. because that's what I just said. They had a child that they didn't think was going to be deaf. Turns out the child was deaf. They attribute that decision, not the deafness, but the decision to have a child, to the doctor's negligence. So the doctor should be forced to pay. Pay what? We'll talk about that when we get to D. Wrongful life. Wrongful life is much more controversial because it treats the claim brought on the child's behalf as saying, I would have been better off if I had not been born. That's a wrongful life claim. Courts are a lot more uncomfortable with those, but even if this is in the minority of jurisdictions that permits a wrongful life claim as opposed to a wrongful birth claim, the damages here are counted incorrectly. And that's what D's about. The damages in a wrongful birth claim can only be the difference between the expenses incurred for raising a normal, and a child with this birth defect. So all of the expenses associated with raising this child cannot be collected. It's only the difference between between the costs associated with raising the child with the birth defect and a normal child. Does that make sense? All right. The good news is that after you take the bar, you will never have to think about wrongful birth or wrongful life again. I guarantee it. If I'm wrong, come see me in 5 years when you're a millionaire for bringing wrongful birth claims. I hesitate to say this, but this one was pretty easy. This is the quintessential paradigmatic private necessity claim. There's a storm. I'm going to lose my boat. There's a dock. The person who owns that dock doesn't want me to hook my boat up to the dock. But my only option is to either hook the boat up to that dock or lose my boat and maybe die. That's a greater harm to whatever harm is going to happen to this dock. That is the doctrine of private necessity. Commit the trespass to avoid the greater harm. But it's a qualified defense. Why is it a qualified defense? Because if I mess up this dock, I have to pay this guy. I can't say I committed the trespass to avoid the greater harm and therefore I owe you nothing. If I harm the dock, because again, that's the lesser harm, right? Any harm that I do to the dock is going to be less than the total loss of my boat. But I have to compensate the landowner for any harm that my trespass causes. That's why private necessity is a qualified defense. So, if you know that A is wrong. The private necessity defense is a defense to the trespass. The trespass still happens. This is a trespass. Even in the absence of these no trespassing signs, it's probably still a trespass. Yeah, I committed a trespass, but under the doctrine of private necessity, I'm only liable for damages to the peer. B, that implies that there's no such thing as private necessity, right? If I was reasonable in my belief that my boat was going to sink, then I can commit the trespass. C, red herring. Owner of the boat is going to have to pay any damages. Whether or not he offered to pay before the fact, not relevant. And then D is right. Questions about that one? All right. Again, if you got it wrong, it's nothing, doesn't mean you're bad, but this one was also pretty easy. False imprisonment. False imprisonment is an intentional tort. And you didn't need to know anything else about false imprisonment to get this right. If it's an intentional tort, the very first word of this question is going to put you in the right direction. So what are the elements? Act or omission with intent to confine against the will, knows of or is injured by the confinement. A, whether or not it's unusual, that goes to what she should have known, and that is negligence. B, as we said, is right. In the absence of any transferred intent issue, right? If you don't intend to confine, you can't be liable for false imprisonment. C, what she should have done, whether or not she acted reasonably is not relevant to an intentional tort. And awareness, that's an element, but you still need intent. And without intent, no liability. There's the dog. Every year, some first-year student says, somebody hurts my dog, I should be able to sue them for intentional infliction of emotional distress. I and everybody else in the class laughs. And we say, no, as you'll see, the claim here is actually a trespass to chattel. Or as they say in France, chattel. You guys know why it's, my students know this, why it's pronounced chattel? Because when you sold the land, it didn't include the cattle. The cattle was a chattel. You need to remember that for the bar. There's the land and there's the cattle. There's the land and there's the chattel. So what are the elements of trespass to chattel? The interference has to be substantial, right? It's the difference between walking out of the restaurant in the winter and putting the other guy's hat on by accident, getting down the street, seeing it's not your hat and bringing it back, and keeping the guy's hat for 2 months. The interference with the chattel has to be substantial. It can't be what some of the older cases call a harmless intermeddling with the chattel. How do we measure whether or not the interference or deprivation was substantial? We use time. Or sometimes we use the difference between hitting and pulling gently. Does the man have a claim? A, no, because the interference with the chattel was not substantial. And that's right. You're talking about the chattel. You're not talking about harms to the owner, because this is a trespass to chattel's claim. The question told us that. So if you're talking about harm to the chattel, the first thing you're going to do is ignore any harm to the owner of the chattel. That's what D is about, at least. This is about the chattel. The chattel is the dog. The fact pattern told us that there was no harm to the dog, no claim for trespass to chattel. If children could not form intent for intentional torts cases, the case books would be empty. Right? The whole first month of law school you talked about intentional torts caused by children. Liability. Child runs over other child with snowmobile. Child hits other child with paperclip in face. All that stuff. Of course a child can form intent. Consent, that's not enough. Even touching the chattel without consent. If you're foolish enough to pet a dog that you don't know, that's not, you have not committed a trespass to chattel. That's not enough. Contrast that, if you need to remember it, with trespass to land, right? Excuse me. Thanks. With a trespass to land, just entering the land is enough. With trespass to chattel, you need more. And then, as we said, this wimp, having suffered extreme distress because his dog was touched, not relevant to the trespass to chattels claim. Any questions about that? It's the last one. Another easy one. Mother and her 6-year-old child. Mother stops to talk to a neighbor. Child is probably a boy based on my experience as a parent. Child throws himself against the neighbor. Old lady suffers a broken wrist. Neighbor sues child for battery. The elements of battery. This is like the first thing you guys did in law school. What a great way to end it. By end it, I mean end it for me, not for you. What's the strongest argument for liability? So let's start with B. Oh, I didn't know that I could break her wrist. I just bumped into her. I didn't intend to cause that much harm. Wrong. The intent is only to cause a contact that is harmful or offensive. Refer again to the eggshell skull rule, right? You can't go around in life knocking over old ladies and then in defense as to claim a battery say, oh, I didn't intend to break her hip. I just wanted to hip check her. It's not how torts works. The intent is only to cause a contact that is harmful or offensive. Here, the intent was to cause a contact that was at least offensive and maybe even harmful. C is the same thing, I think. Doesn't matter what the child did or did not appreciate. What's only relevant is that the child committed an act with intent to cause a contact that was harmful or offensive. D, that to me sounds like self-defense, right? And I don't see any claim of self-defense. So the answer, in conclusion, is A. What else? I am your torts teacher through July 31st. So if you have any questions, anything that comes up in an essay or an MBE, email me and I will email you back, I promise. Everybody in here and everybody over there, maybe more so them than you, But everybody in here can pass the bar. But you have to work to do it. Even learned hand studied for 12 or 15 hours a day to pass the bar, I'm sure. Because it's not, I mean, this is unfortunate, but it's not necessarily about analysis. It's about seeing this stuff that you may not have seen before and understanding enough of it to be able to muddle through enough of these questions where you get some of them right. It is what it is. You want to be a lawyer. Real.
Do you know, like, what the average percent is that will have to get right to pass the MBE section? Like, if it's 70% of the questions are.
Barilla would know the answer to that question. 70% sounds high, but I don't know. I just know that where you want to be at certain points, you want to get to 50% as soon as you can. And then when you get to 70%, then you can actually start leaving stuff off. If you start getting 8 out of 10 right in torts, then it is really inefficient to continue to study torts. You need to move on to evidence where you've been getting 3 out of 10. So be confident. Everybody in here can pass. Good luck.
Thank you.